In the spring of 1993, 4 US Army combat engineers were laying high explosive charges in the forest of Oregon's Coast Range when 3 figures stepped out of the tree line and stood there, watching them work.
This is Todd Neiss's account. The figures were between 7 and 9 feet tall.
But all that changed for me in 1993 while conducting a military exercise in the Oregon Coast Range. I and 3 other soldiers were exposed to 3 of these creatures observing our exercises, and those 25 seconds changed the entire course of my life. What I had observed was that they were
covered in hair. Their proportions, long arms, long legs relative to their torsos, were not human, but their faces were close enough to human that the men watching them couldn't look away. For 25 seconds, nobody on either side moved. The soldiers watched. The creatures watched. Then the creatures were gone.
I'm Alex, and on this channel I try to be careful with stories that sound like this. Most accounts of 3 Bigfoot at once collapse the moment you press them. 1 witness, 1 glimpse, bad light, maybe alcohol, and many other things. But this one is none of these.
This case is different. It is not 1 witness, it is 4. And they were sober, and they were in formation, and they were in daylight, and they were on a prepared demolition site with their eyes already pointed outward, because that is the entire job of a combat engineer setting charges. They were the kind of witnesses skeptics demand and almost never get. And one of those 4 men has spent every year since trying to find them again. His name is Todd Neiss. He has crossed 9 states and 1 Canadian province looking for whatever stepped out of those trees. He coined his own framework for primate intelligence to make sense of it. He has built infrastructure, written a book, and hosts an annual gathering of international researchers most people have never heard of. 4 men, 3 creatures, 25 seconds. That is the math. The rest of his life is what he has been doing with it. I want to be honest about what this story has going for it before I push on what it doesn't. Because if you strip the word Bigfoot out of the previous paragraph and replaced it with the name of any other rare large mammal, a wolverine sighting, a wolf pack, a cougar at unusual elevation, the witness pool here would be considered overwhelming. Multiple trained observers, sustained daylight observation, independent corroboration in real time, a prepared secured site with no obstructions, recent and consistent post-event testimony from the primary witness. That is not a hunter at dusk.
The silhouette, if you will, was completely disproportionate in terms of the arm length and even the length of the legs as it pertains to a human torso. Obviously very large. The ones I saw range between 7 to 9 feet in height. They do tend to have a more human-like face and obviously just hair covered, very large, very athletic.
That's not a hiker spooked by a shadow at the edge of a campfire. That is the witness profile a wildlife biologist would build their case on. So I want to know what happened in those 25 seconds. I want to know what 3 creatures 7 to 9 feet tall were doing watching a demolitions exercise at all. Because the noise alone of combat engineers prepping a site should have driven any normal animal out of that quadrant of forest hours earlier. I want to know what the other 3 soldiers said behind closed doors and what they have or haven't said in the 33 years since. And I want to know what happens inside a man who walks out of those woods, a confirmed skeptic, and never goes back to who he was before. And there is one detail that matters more than any other, and that I'm going to come back to several times in this video. The US Army never filed an incident report on what those 4 men saw. There is no official paper trail. The sighting only survives because Todd Neiss refused to let it die. You don't see something for 25 seconds and forget it. He didn't. He built 33 years on top of it. So here's how I want to weigh this case with you. 3 lenses, and I'm going to keep coming back to them. The first is witness quality. Who were these men? What was their training? What was their state of mind? What was the lighting? What was the terrain? What was the time of observation? In the wildlife biology world, this is called the credibility profile, and you can do it for any sighting of anything. The Neiss case has one of the higher scoring credibility profiles you can build for a North American Bigfoot encounter. And I want to walk through exactly why before any of you accuse me of overselling it. The second is the observation itself. What did the 4 men actually see? Not what they have said in interviews 30 years later. What were the specific physical details they reported in the days and weeks afterward? And how have those details held up under repeated retelling? Because if there's one place a Bigfoot story usually falls apart, it's in the drift between the original account and the polished version on the conference circuit. The third lens is what Neiss did with the rest of his life. This is the part most coverage skips, and I think it's the most important part. Because a witness who saw something and then went home and lived a normal life is one kind of evidence. A witness who saw something and then spent 33 years building an entire research methodology around it is a different kind of evidence, and not necessarily a better kind. Because the longer you live inside a story, the harder it gets to see the parts of it you got wrong. A few hard numbers up front, so the rest of this video has anchors. 1993, 25 seconds, 3 creatures, 4 witnesses. The 1,249th Combat Engineer Battalion. 33 years and counting. 16 years of a research retreat called Beachfoot. 20 plus years in uniform, an Iraq war deployment, meritorious retirement, an 11.5-acre ranch in the Ozarks, a self-coined framework for primate intelligence that no peer-reviewed journal has touched. I'm not going to tell you what those 4 men saw. I'm going to lay out what they say they saw, what the strongest skeptic on earth would say in response, and then leave you with the weight. Todd Neiss grew up in the Pacific Northwest, which is to say he grew up downstream of the Patterson-Gimlin film, John Green, Peter Byrne, and every campfire story that ever got told around a Coleman lantern between the Cascades and the Pacific Ocean. He has said publicly more than once that he gave Bigfoot stories the same weight he gave Loch Ness and the Bermuda Triangle. They were entertainment. They were not real. He enlisted in the Army. By 1993, he was a sergeant in the 1,249th Combat Engineer Battalion, an Oregon-based unit. If you don't know what a combat engineer does, here's the relevant part. They are the people the Army trusts with controlled detonations. Their training covers explosives, demolitions, breaching, route clearance, and military bridging. The professional standard for a combat engineer at work is composed, sober, methodical, and aware of the people around you. Because the cost of being any of those things less is that you or someone next to you ends the day in pieces. This matters because the cliché, skeptical objection to a Bigfoot encounter is that the witness was tired, scared, half-drunk, alone, or already primed to see something. None of that applies to Neiss in 1993. He was on duty. He was with his unit. He was setting up controlled charges, which means his attention was pointed outward. His hearing was sharp because he hadn't fired yet. And his expectation set was for hazards in the work area, not for cryptids in the tree line. He has also said repeatedly and on record that before this happened, he was a skeptic. I personally think the prior skepticism of a witness matters more than people give it credit for, and it cuts both ways. A believer who sees Bigfoot is confirming what they already wanted to be true. A skeptic who sees Bigfoot is fighting against their own prior, which is harder, and the fact that they came out the other end of it with a story they couldn't shake is at least worth weighing. I don't think prior skepticism is proof of anything. I think it's a credibility multiplier worth a couple of clicks. A few months back on this channel, I did a deep dive on the FBI's Bigfoot file, the Peter Byrne hair sample, the 1976 letter, the 2019 FOIA release. Byrne was another sober, lifelong investigator. The pattern of credible men taking this question seriously is not new. Neiss is the next link in that chain. The Oregon Coast Range in the spring is one of the densest temperate rainforests in North America. Sitka spruce, western hemlock, Douglas fir, big leaf maple. The understory is sword fern and salmonberry, head high in places, low in others, and the canopy is thick enough that the light on the forest floor at midday looks more like the light at sunset somewhere else. It rains a lot. It is also statistically one of the most consistent regions for reported Sasquatch sightings in the lower 48. That spring, the 1,249th was running a live fire training exercise involving high explosive charges. The specifics of the operation are not the point. The relevant facts are that the exercise required a prepared work site, a defined perimeter, lookouts posted facing outward, eyes on terrain, ears tuned for movement, and a small professional team of soldiers in formation. Neiss has described what happened next in roughly the same way for 33 years, which is something I want to flag now because consistency over time is one of the few things you can actually measure about a witness who has zero physical evidence to back them up. 3 figures stepped clear of the tree line. They did not approach, they did not vocalize, they did not retreat. They stood there at the edge of the work area and watched. Neiss has said their silhouettes were completely disproportionate in the arm length and leg length relative to a human torso. They were 7 to 9 feet tall. They had human-like faces, but the rest of them was hair-covered. He has also said, and this is the detail I keep coming back to, that for 25 seconds nothing happened. 4 soldiers locked eyes on 3 creatures. 3 creatures locked eyes on 4 soldiers. Nobody fired, nobody chased, nobody radioed, nobody yelled. There was no chain of command moment. There was just a long, suspended, mutual observation, and then the 3 figures were gone. I personally think the most underweighted detail in this whole story is the staring. 3 creatures stood there and watched 4 armed men set up demolitions for 25 seconds. That is not flight. That is not fear. That is interest. Whatever those things were, they were not afraid of the soldiers, and they were not in a hurry. They had the time to make the choice to walk to the edge of an active military training site and look. That detail alone reframes the whole encounter for me. It is not the story of an animal startled and caught. It is the story of an animal that chose to be there. The 3 other soldiers in the unit independently corroborated what Neiss saw. They have not been named in public, they have not done interviews, and we are taking Neiss's word for the existence of their corroboration. I'll come back to that in the next section because it is the single fairest skeptical objection to this case, and it deserves to be sat with, not glossed over. But for now, here's what I'm asking you to hold in your head. 3 figures, 25 seconds, daylight, 4 trained witnesses, a sustained, deliberate, mutual stare across a prepared military work site in one of the densest forests on the continent. The most interesting thing about the Neiss case is not what happened during those 25 seconds. It is what didn't happen in the hours after. There was no incident report. The Army has no formal protocol for what to do when 4 soldiers see 3 cryptid hominids on a training exercise, because of course it doesn't, and the 4 men involved had a real and immediate understanding of what would happen to their careers and their reputations if anything went on paper. So nothing did. The sighting was logged nowhere, surfaced in no chain of command, and entered no official record. If you wanted to FOIA the Army for documentation of the 1993 Oregon Coast Range Bigfoot sighting, you would receive nothing because nothing was ever written down. This is not a cover-up. There is no shadowy government program suppressing the encounter. There is something more interesting going on, which is that the 4 men in that unit performed the suppression on themselves in real time because the social cost of telling the truth about what they had seen was higher than the cost of keeping their mouths shut. That is its own kind of evidence about how the Bigfoot question gets handled inside institutions that would otherwise be the most credible sources we have. Neiss did not go public for years. The other 3 witnesses, as far as we know, have never gone public at all. Their identities and their roles in the unit have not been independently verified. Neiss has said they exist, has said they corroborated his account, and has been consistent on that point, but that is the spine of the case, and we are taking him at his word. I personally think this is the single fairest skeptical objection to the Neiss story. Multi-witness corroboration is the strongest thing the case has going for it. It is also the part of the case that depends most heavily on one man's say-so, because the other 3 witnesses have not stepped forward to confirm anything in their own voice. That is not nothing. A skeptic working in good faith would put that detail at the top of their list. It does not destroy the case. Plenty of military and law enforcement personnel who have seen things they cannot explain decline to talk about them publicly for the rest of their lives, and the silence of the corroborators is consistent with that pattern. But it is the gap, and I want to name it openly because the alternative, pretending it isn't a gap, is the kind of move this channel does not make.
The hardest part of this case is that the strongest piece, the 4 witnesses, not one, is the part we have to take on trust. I'd rather sit with that, honestly, than pretend the gap isn't true.
Some witnesses see something and go home and try to forget it. Todd Neiss did the opposite. The 25 seconds in the Coast Range did not just change his beliefs. They changed his career trajectory, his retirement plan, the state he eventually lived in, and the shape of his second act. He did not become a Bigfoot believer. He became a Bigfoot investigator. By his own count, he has run expeditions in Oregon, Washington, Northern California, Arizona, Alaska, Ohio, Nebraska, Arkansas, Oklahoma, and British Columbia. That is 9 U.S. states and 1 Canadian province over roughly 3 decades of weekend and leave research. In 2015, after retiring from the Army with 20-plus years of service and an Iraq War deployment behind him, he formalized the work and founded the American Primate Conservancy as an Oregon nonprofit. The mission, in his own published wording, is the discovery, knowledge, research, recognition, and protection of the Sasquatch. He is not running a hobby. He is running a project. He has been featured on Unsolved Mysteries, Encounters, To the Ends of the Earth, the History Channel's The Unexplained, with William Shatner, the Discovery Channel, the Travel Channel, and National Geographic. He has produced his own documentary, Operation Sea Monkey, about a 2016 expedition in the uninhabited Broughton Archipelago of coastal British Columbia. He has taught classes on the subject for the Audubon Society and the Campfire Boys and Girls Society, including an overnight working camp in the dark divide of Washington's Gifford-Pinchot National Forest. He has guest instructed at a middle school's outdoor program 3 years running. That is not the resume of a man working through trauma in his garage. That is the resume of someone who has built a full second career on the back of a single 25-second event. And here is the honest, skeptical pushback that has to come in the same paragraph. The psychological literature on what researchers sometimes call road to Damascus experiences, single transformative events that pivot a person's worldview, suggests they entrench belief in ways that resist later falsification. You become invested in being right about what happened. You filter incoming evidence through the lens of the moment that changed you. That is not lying. That is human cognition under specific load conditions. And it is at least worth naming as this video sits with the rest of the story. Every summer for the last 16 years, Todd Neiss has hosted an invitation-only gathering of international Bigfoot researchers on the Oregon coast. It is called Beachfoot. The 2025 event marked the 16th anniversary, which means 2026 will be the 17th. Researchers have flown in from Australia, Russia, England, Canada, New Zealand, and nearly every state in the United States. Beachfoot is not a public conference. It is not a vendor expo with a stage. It is not the Ohio Bigfoot Conference or the Hanobia Festival or any of the other community events where you pay $40 for a wristband and listen to 4 speakers in a hotel ballroom. It is a closed retreat by invitation on private terms. What that means for the rest of us is that we have only partial public information about what gets discussed there. I want to be careful here because Beachfoot's invitation-only structure cuts in 2 different directions, and an honest read of this case has to acknowledge both. The believer's reading is that Beachfoot is exactly what credible scientific work in this field looks like when it cannot operate inside mainstream institutions. Real researchers, real data sharing, real methodology, all of it kept out of the media circus, because the media circus is what destroys serious work in this field every time it tries to surface. Under that reading, Beachfoot's quiet existence is one of the more under-discussed credibility markers in the entire Sasquatch research community. You can dismiss any one researcher as a crank, but you cannot easily dismiss the fact that 50 or 60 serious people have flown across continents to the same Oregon retreat for 16 straight years in private, on their own dime, to share data with each other. The skeptic's reading is that an invitation-only event with no public proceedings is by definition an unverifiable claim about what serious Bigfoot research looks like. We cannot audit who attends. We cannot audit what they discuss. We cannot audit whether the data sharing happens at all. And historically, closed circles and fringe research fields tend to reinforce shared beliefs rather than test them, because the price of admission is already agreeing with the premise. Both readings are honest. I personally lean toward the first one, partly because the names that have orbited Beachfoot over the years, including Dr. Jeff Meldrum, who I covered on this channel a few weeks ago, are not the names of people who fly to remote Oregon retreats 16 times to lie to each other. But I won't pretend the skeptic's version is unfair. It is the cost of running a closed event in a field that has earned every ounce of suspicion the public throws at it.
You can roll your eyes at any one Bigfoot researcher. It's harder though when 50 of them have flown to Oregon every summer for 16 years on their own dime. Whatever they're doing there, they're doing it seriously.
In 2022, Todd Neiss did something most cryptid researchers don't do. He named his own framework. He called it the Primal Intelligence Quotient, or PIQ, and he positioned it explicitly against what he calls the Academic Intelligence Quotient, or AIQ. The argument is more interesting than it sounds, and I think it is worth taking seriously enough to engage with on its own terms before any of us decide whether we agree with it. The premise is this: human intelligence tests measure a specific kind of cognition, abstract reasoning, pattern matching on symbol sets, language manipulation, working memory under control conditions. They are good at predicting how a person will perform in school, in white-collar work, in tasks designed by other humans. They are not designed to measure intelligence in any other species. They're not even designed to measure the kinds of intelligence humans display in environments humans evolved in: wilderness navigation, predator avoidance, resource location, social hierarchy reading, environmental adaptation. Neiss's argument is that Sasquatch, if Sasquatch exists, may possess a significantly higher PIQ than humans do, even if it would score 0 on a paper and pencil IQ test. And he points to specific behavioral patterns that would be consistent with that. The evasion record, the apparent self-awareness of being observed, the geographic discipline that keeps reported encounters mostly in low population zones, the consistent reports across decades of being watched from cover without being able to spot the watcher. He pairs this with a research methodology he has openly modeled on 3 names: Jane Goodall, Birute Galdikas, and Dian Fossey. Long-duration immersion in habitat, on the order of 45 to 60 days per rotation. Patient acclimatization, non-threatening presence, the willingness to spend the time it takes for the animal to decide you are not a threat, instead of trying to catch the animal before it makes that decision. I personally think PIQ is the smartest thing Neiss has ever said, and the most epistemically dangerous thing he has ever said at the same time. It is smart because it reframes a stubborn evidence gap as a behavioral feature. The most common skeptical objection to Sasquatch is the absence of clear photographs after 50 years of cell phones in the woods. PIQ has a real answer for that. They're smarter than us at not being photographed. That is a falsifiable claim in principle. It predicts that Sasquatch evidence will accumulate as indirect traces, peripheral observations, secondhand reports, and short, close-range encounters that end the moment the witness reaches for a camera, which broadly is what the existing record looks like. What makes it epistemically dangerous is the same thing: a framework that can absorb every absence of evidence by attributing it to the cleverness of the subject is functionally unfalsifiable. Every missing photograph becomes another data point for PIQ. That is the textbook pattern of motivated reasoning, and any honest reader of this material has to flag it. Both can be true. PIQ is a smart reframe. It is also a hypothesis that protects itself from being wrong. Sit with both. Todd Neiss is not the only soldier who has reported seeing what he saw, and I want to walk through this carefully because I covered the Trans-Alaska pipeline workers on this channel, and I covered a wildland firefighter encounter not long after that, and I'm aware that the occupational witness lane is starting to get crowded. The pattern is real. There is a thin but consistent thread of military and federal personnel sightings in the documented record. The Indian Army's 2019 documentation of large bipedal footprints near Makalu Base Camp in the Himalayas was photographed, posted from the official Army account, and accompanied by an official statement. Peter Burns' work alongside U.S. Forest Service personnel in the Pacific Northwest, work that ended up in the file the FBI released in 2019, is part of the same broader pattern. Paul Freeman, a U.S. Forest Service patrolman, made his 1982 track casts under conditions that put him in the same general witness category. The Neiss case sits inside that lane, and you can read it as evidence for or against the broader pattern depending on your priors. The believer's reading is that a thin, consistent thread of sober, trained, articulate witnesses with no obvious motive to lie is the closest thing this entire field has to a control group. These are not children. They are not drunk hunters. They are not amateurs. If we discount them, we are discounting a category of evidence on grounds we would not apply to any other large mammal sighting. The skeptic's reading is that the size of that thread is so small relative to the number of military, law enforcement, and federal personnel who have spent time in wilderness terrain that selection bias is a more plausible explanation than a real phenomenon. Veterans are public-facing, they are articulate, they have networks that amplify their stories. The fact that you can name half a dozen of them does not mean a comparable number of reports exists per capita. It may just mean these are the ones who get picked up by media, I think both readings are doing real work. The honest answer is somewhere in the middle, and I'm not interested in pretending otherwise. Dr. Jane Goodall died in 2025. She was, by every reasonable metric, one of the most respected scientists of the 20th century, and the modern study of primate behavior in the wild does not exist as a field in its current form without her work in Gombe. She was also asked more than once what she thought about Bigfoot. In 2018, Yahoo Entertainment ran an interview in which she answered. I'm going to paraphrase her rather than quote her verbatim because the same line has been recycled in every Bigfoot documentary made in the last decade, and you deserve the substance, not the soundbite. What she said, in effect, was that she was a romantic about it. She would like Bigfoot to exist. She had met people who swore they had seen one. She could not dismiss them. She didn't know what was out there. She thought there was something. That is not an endorsement. It is the most precisely calibrated statement an honest scientist can make when she has spent her entire career talking to witnesses, weighing testimony, and watching the public misread her own data on chimpanzees. She was not saying Bigfoot is real. She was saying she could not rule it out, and that the people who told her they had seen one did not seem to her to be lying. This matters specifically for the Neiss case because Neiss has built his methodology around Goodall's name. He has said it openly, in public, more than once. He is not claiming the woman. He is claiming the approach, the patience, the non-intrusion, the willingness to let the animal decide. And if you grant him the framework, then the question stops being, is Neiss a credible witness? And starts being, is Goodall's methodology applied to a different hypothetical species, capable of producing evidence on the timescale Neiss is willing to give it. The strongest version of the skeptic's case here, I think, comes from Benjamin Radford of Skeptical Inquirer. Radford has said publicly that he is not a skeptic because he doesn't want Bigfoot to be real. He is a skeptic because the evidence so far does not meet the bar. He has said that if anyone finds a Bigfoot, he wants to be first in line. That is the gold standard skeptical posture, and it is one Goodall herself would have respected. In 2023, a researcher named Flo Foxon published a paper that the skeptical community has been quoting heavily ever since, and it has come back into rotation this year because of the Ohio Bigfoot flap I covered on this channel a few weeks ago. The paper found a strong statistical correlation between reported Bigfoot encounters and black bear population density across the United States and Canada. The claim, in the strongest version skeptics make of it, is that a meaningful share of Bigfoot sightings are misidentified bears. The claim is plausible. Black bears do occasionally stand bipedally for short periods, especially adolescents with mange or hind leg injuries. Their proportions can read as much larger than they actually are when they're standing in low light. There is excellent recent footage of bipedal bears that has been mistaken for Bigfoot in good faith by experienced outdoors people. The Foxon research is some of the most useful skeptical work the field has seen in 5 years, and you should not dismiss it. But here's what happens when you apply Foxon honestly to the Neiss case, instead of using it as a one-size-fits-all dismissal. 3 bears at once. That is unusual, but not impossible. A sow with 2 large cubs would account for it. So far, so good for the bear hypothesis. Sustained bipedal observation for 25 seconds. That is far outside the documented behavior pattern for black bears. They stand briefly to extend their visual range and then drop back down. 25 seconds of upright, motionless, mutual observation is not a bear behavior anyone in the wildlife literature has documented. 7 to 9 feet tall. The largest verified American black bears stand around 7 feet erect under exceptional conditions. 3 of them simultaneously, all hitting the upper edge of the size range, in formation at the same time, is a possibility a bear biologist would describe as extraordinarily unlikely. The witness pool, 4 combat engineers in the Oregon Coast Range have seen bears before. They are not novices. They are not from out of state. They are not from the suburbs. They are people who work outdoors with explosives and have been trained to identify hazards. The Demolitions context. Black bears are extremely noise-averse. The acoustic signature of a combat engineer team setting charges, voices, radio chatter, equipment, vehicle activity would have driven any normal bear out of that quadrant of forest long before the soldiers were ready to observe anything in the tree line. I personally think Foxson's research is the most useful skeptical paper of the last 5 years, and it would be devastating applied to a single hiker at dusk reporting a distant figure in low light. Applied to a multi-witness daylight sustained sighting by trained soldiers on a prepared site, it loses most of its explanatory power. That doesn't mean it loses all of it. Misidentification under stress can affect even trained observers, but it stops being the silver bullet skeptics sometimes treat it as. A serious skeptic of the Neiss case has to engage with the specifics of the Neiss case. The Foxson paper is not a substitute for that engagement. It's a starting point for it.
The Foxson paper is a real research and deserves to be taken seriously. It just runs out of road against 4 trained witnesses in daylight.
A few years ago, Todd Neiss retired from the Pacific Northwest and moved to an 11.5-acre ranch near Jasper, Arkansas in the Ozark National Forest, perched high above the Buffalo National River. He has said publicly that he relocated to spend his retirement on the ranch and continue his research. The Ozarks are a Bigfoot lane I haven't covered on this channel yet, and I'm going to. The tradition there goes deep, the witness pool is older and quieter than the Pacific Northwest's, and the terrain is some of the most isolated remaining hardwood forest east of the Mississippi. Expect a video on it. The American Primate Conservancy continues to operate. Neiss has published what he calls a 4-phase operation plan, which is publicly available on the organization's website. The plan progresses from intelligence gathering through habituation through evidence collection. The long-term institutional goal, as he has stated it, is to establish a Bigfoot interpretive center in the Pacific Northwest, a facility that would include a museum, a library, a forensics lab, classrooms, an art gallery, an auditorium, and an outdoor amphitheater. I want to flag this directly because it cuts both ways for honest analysis. The believer's reading is that Neiss has spent 33 years not just talking but building. He has incorporated, he has fundraised, he has organized, he has produced. He has the resume of a man working a real long-term project, and that is rare and it is hard. People who are making things up tend not to spend 20 years on incorporation paperwork and grant applications. The skeptic's reading is that the longer Neiss is invested in this project, the more he has to lose if he is wrong about what happened in the Oregon Coast Range in 1993. He has reputational capital tied up in the answer. He has plans for a physical facility that depend on the question continuing to matter. He has a financial interest in the Conservancy's mission being a real one. None of that means he is lying. All of it means he is no longer a disinterested witness, and at this distance from the event, he never will be again. I personally think the move to Arkansas is the most overlooked detail in the entire Neiss biography. He did not retire to a beach in Mexico. He did not buy a condo in Phoenix. He retired deeper into Bigfoot country, into one of the few remaining American wilderness corridors where the question is still being asked seriously by people who live there. That is what a 33-year answer looks like.
If you'd had 25 seconds in those woods that wouldn't let you go, what would you do with the rest of your life? Drop it in the comments and subscribe for more like this.
On May 5th, 2026, Todd Neiss appeared on Fox & Friends First and walked national television viewers through the spring of 1993 again. He talked about the silhouettes, the disproportionate limbs, the 25 seconds. He talked about his subsequent work and the American Primate Conservancy. He talked about Ohio.
Ohio is actually, believe it or not, ranked number 4 of all the states in the United States that have sightings. So a little pocket of them in them there woods, if you will.
Which a couple of months earlier had become the unlikely center of the most publicized Bigfoot story in 50 years. Most of the coverage missed why his appearance mattered, so I want to say it out loud. I covered the Ohio Bigfoot flap on this channel earlier this year. 8 high-credibility sightings in a 5-day window across Portage County in March 2026, mapped by the Bigfoot Society podcast, investigated on the ground by the Ohio Squatch Project, covered by CNN, Newsweek, Fox News, NPR, and Cleveland 19. The Ohio flap put Bigfoot back into mainstream news coverage for the first time in years, and the field was suddenly being asked the question by reporters who did not normally cover it. And at almost exactly the same moment, a documentary called Capturing Bigfoot premiered at South by Southwest. I also covered that one. The documentary's central claim is that the Patterson-Gimlin film, the foundational piece of evidence the entire modern Bigfoot field rests on, was staged in 1966, and that a long-lost rehearsal reel surfaced from a Boeing film technician's safe proves it. Whether or not you accept the documentary's conclusion, the cultural effect of it is undeniable. The Bigfoot believer community has been described as being torn apart by it. The foundational case is being shaken in public for the first time in 50 years. And in the middle of all that, Todd Neiss walks into a Fox News studio at 6 a.m. to talk about a daylight, multi-witness, sustained observation sighting from 1993 that nobody can connect to a costume, a film canister, or a Patterson-Gimlin-shaped story. I personally think the timing of this is the more important story than either piece alone. As one category of evidence is getting shaken, the iconic, much-analyzed single-witness, on-camera kind, a different category of evidence is moving into the foreground. Sober witnesses, multiple corroborators, daylight, no film at all, just testimony held consistently over decades, by people who had no reason to make any of it up. That is not a coincidence. That is a re-weighting, and I think this channel is going to be watching it happen in real time for the next year. Let me bring this back to the 3 lenses I installed at the start, because I want you to leave this video with something you can do with the information instead of just a vibe. Witness quality, high but not perfect. Trained soldiers in formation, sober, in daylight, on a prepared site, with their attention pointed outward by the nature of the work. 4 of them, not 1. That is the witness pool a wildlife biologist would build a case on. The asterisk is that 3 of the 4 have never spoken publicly, and the case for their corroboration rests on the word of the 4th, what they observed. 3 figures, 7 to 9 feet tall, hair-covered with disproportionate limb-to-torso ratios and human-like facial features. 25 seconds of mutual stationary observation across an open work area. No vocalization, no threat display, no flight. The figure simply chose to be there, and then they chose to leave. The detail set has been consistent across 33 years of retelling, which is one of the few things you can actually measure about a story with no physical artifacts, what he did with it. 33 years of expeditions, a non-profit, an invitation-only annual research retreat that has drawn international attendees for 16 years, a self-coined framework for primate intelligence, a documentary, a retirement to deeper Bigfoot country, a plan for a physical research facility, a second career that has, by any reasonable measure, been a serious one. The honest verdict is that there is no body, no photograph, no DNA, and no piece of physical evidence anyone outside the 4-man unit could test. There's also no obvious alternative explanation that fits the witness pool, the observation duration, the lighting conditions, and the corroboration pattern. The skeptic's strongest case is that a single transformative 25-second event has entrenched a worldview that is no longer falsifiable. The believer's strongest case is that this is the witness pool skeptics demand and almost never get. Both arguments are sitting on the same set of facts. I'm not going to tell you what to do with that. I have my own read, and you can probably guess what it is. But the entire point of this channel is that you weigh it yourself. I want to leave you with one question. Imagine 25 seconds in a forest somewhere. Imagine 3 creatures stepping clear of the tree line and watching you do your job. Imagine the other 3 people next to you seeing the same thing at the same time. Imagine knowing, with the kind of certainty you usually only get about the people you grew up with, that what you saw was real and that nothing in your life has prepared you to explain it. What would you do with the rest of your years? Most of us would go home. Most of us would tell the story 2 or 3 times to people we trusted and then watch it slowly become a thing we had stopped saying out loud. Most of us would let it become a memory we kept private, the way you keep the strange detail of a dream you can't quite parse a week later. That is the human default, and there is no shame in it. Todd Neiss did something different. He spent the next 33 years walking back into those woods. I personally don't know if he found what he was looking for. I don't know if anyone ever will. But I know the question he is asking is more interesting than the answer most people are willing to give it. Next on this channel, I'm going deep on Tom Slick, the Texas oil heir who funded Yeti expeditions into Nepal in the late 1950s, and then turned his attention to the Pacific Northwest before he died in a 1962 plane crash. Slick was the original wealthy patron of serious Sasquatch research, and his story is the bridge between the campfire era and the modern field that Todd Neiss is still walking.
25 seconds, 4 men, 3 creatures, 1 life redirected. Wait however you want, but wait, that's the whole job. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.